Hello, everybody. This is Jennifer Matarese, and before I get started on the episode today, I'd just like to take care of the usual housekeeping. For starters, paid requests are now reopened. If you are interested in submitting a disaster request, please double-check the list of requests I most recently posted to the podcast's Facebook and Tumblr accounts to make sure your request has not already been made. Also, please look through past episodes to verify I haven't already covered the disaster in question. To submit a request, you can send a donation of $30 or more to the podcast's PayPal at disasterarea@mail.com, on Venmo at Disaster Area Podcast, or on Cash App at Disaster Area Pod. Just add the names of the disaster to the notes on your donation. If you have an idea for an episode subject but you're not sure if it qualifies, feel free to message me and I can approve one way or another, although I usually do. This particular episode is a subject of my own choosing, not one that I chose because of recent events, just one that happened to coincide with recent events. If you'd still like to help support the podcast, you can do so with a one-time donation through PayPal, Venmo, or Cash App, or on a per-episode basis through Patreon at www.patreon.com/disasterareapodcast. A per-episode donation of even as little as $1 an episode can help me do things like pay the rent and keep the lights on. And if you do join the Patreon, you will get new episodes ad-free as soon as I record them, rather than waiting until they are released. So if you do become a patron, I would very much appreciate it. You can also follow the podcast on Facebook at Disaster Area Podcast, on Instagram at Disaster Area Pod, and on Tumblr at Disaster Area-podcast. Also, please think about rating and reviewing the podcast on whichever podcast app that you might listen to me on. And as always, the sources for each new episode can be found at disasterareapodcast.wordpress.com and in the episode description wherever you might be listening to me. The sources for this episode include the documentary Miracle on 4th Street, a report from the United States Secret Service using the shooter as part of a case study of the link between domestic violence and mass attacks, a timeline provided by the Washington Post, a YouTube video from KPRC2 in Houston, Texas, titled Sutherland Springs Shooter Recorded His Confession to Severe Beating of Stepson, and another YouTube video from Ken's 5 out of San Antonio entitled Victim Stories Heard through videos of Sutherland Springs church services. Sources also include I'm Not a Hero, man who shot and chased Texas church gunman shares his story from Time magazine. Texas church gunman lied about past to become a security guard record show, and conspiracy theorists harass Sutherland Springs churchgoers, pastor whose daughter was killed, from the Washington Post. From the first deadly shot until the last, how the Texas church shooting unfolded, from news.com.au. Comal County authorities didn't charge Sutherland Springs gunman with rape, even though the victim described brutal attack. And exclusive, guilt and grief overwhelm the mother-in-law of the Sutherland Springs gunman, from the San Antonio Express News. Texas massacre survivors say gunman, and then his name, became enraged by scared children during church shooting, from the New York Daily News. Site of deadliest church shooting in U.S. history is torn down over protests by some Texas families, and Air Force must pay more than $230 million in church shooting, from the Associated Press. And Texas church shooting video shows gunman's methodical attack, officials say, from the New York Times. As per usual with episodes about mass shootings, I will only use the name of the shooter once during the episode. For the rest of the episode, he will be referred to as the gunman, the shooter, the perpetrator, etc. There will be swearing in this episode as well, in multiple quotes from the shooter, so please keep that in mind if you are listening to this at work or in a place where children might hear. I will also be using alternate names for the gunman's 2 wives to respect their privacy given what they experienced at the hands of their husband. They do not deserve to be dragged into this, nor do his children, and so for that matter, none of their names will be shared. I will be sharing the names of the relatives of some of his second wife's family members, some of those family members, but not his wives and not his children. Also, given the events of this episode and the background of the shooter, I would like to issue a trigger warning for the deaths of children, domestic abuse against women and children, and mentions of sexual assault and rape against women, teenage girls, and girls. If you would prefer to skip this episode because of that, I completely understand. I would also like to thank the people who have been checking in on me while I have not been recording episodes. I have been working on episodes, but I have been a little preoccupied with maintaining my mental health and working. So thank you so much for checking in on me. I'm so sorry if I haven't gotten back to you yet, but I'm okay. It's actually my birthday today. It's the September 29th. So happy birthday to me. And with all of that taken care of, thank you very much for listening and welcome to Disaster Area. Episode 256, The Sutherland Springs Church Shooting, Part 1, November 5th, 2017. 27 deceased, 22 injured. I don't think it's a shocker for me to tell you all that America has a very strong gun culture, especially after the last month or so. According to the Pew Research Center, no pun intended, 32% of Americans own at least one gun, with 1 in 4 Americans living in a home which contains a gun. 7 in 10 gun owners state they own a weapon for personal protection, with half as many using them for hunting and sporting. Americans of all political leanings, genders, incomes, religious stripes, etc. keep a gun in their home, in their car, or even on their person as they go about their daily lives. There are plenty of gun-owning Americans who understand it is highly unlikely they will ever have to whip out their gun to stop a robber or an active shooter. But there are also plenty who believe that if something should happen, they will be the only thing standing between that criminal and their victims before police can arrive. Whether or not they are right is something that only time and luck can show one way or another. But the belief that a, quote, good guy with a gun, unquote, who isn't a police officer on the job will take down a mass shooter is something which a great deal of gun owners not only believe is possible, but believe could happen more often if only we had more guns available throughout the public. There's even been a movie about that scenario, sort of. Run, Hide, Fight, a title taken from the advice given to workers and students in the event of an active shooter. Run first, hide if you can, fight if you need to. Many mass shooters in this country usually take themselves out or are taken down by law enforcement, dead or alive. However, one of the top 10 deadliest mass shootings in modern American history was ended by the participation of just such a good guy with a gun. Now, Sutherland Springs, Texas is a small town. It is a tiny town of only about 600 people. That's an hour's drive to the east of San Antonio. From above, in satellite photos, Sutherland Springs sits on the intersection of 2 major roads, U.S. Highway 87 and Farm to Market Road 539, in what looks like a wobbly X. Now, I am being highly complimentary to these 2 roads. I say they're major, but we're talking about like 2-lane, 3-lane, 4-lane roads, depending on where you are on these roads. So they are major roads in terms of like a small town in the middle of nowhere, but if you were, say, somebody who was from a city or something like that, you would think, no, these are not major roads. Anyway, U.S. Highway 87 sits kind of northwest to southeast, and Farm to Market Road 539 sits from northeast to southwest. So that's kind of how you have that X arranged. It's clear just looking at Sutherland Springs from above that it's one of those tiny walkable towns where parents love raising kids despite there being no schools in town. There's not much there. A Tex-Mex restaurant, a couple of convenience stores and gas stations, a Dollar General, and a church. The First Baptist Church of Sutherland Springs sat on part of a lot in the southern corner of the town's major intersection, across from an SS Express gas station and convenience store on the eastern corner, and the town's post office to the north. Now, The rest of the town, we're talking about maybe like 12 blocks. There are a couple of roads that run parallel to 87 or sort of parallel. One of those is 4th Street, which is more to like the southwest in terms of running, parallel to 87. And that is a major street in this particular story. So what you want to keep in mind is you have that intersection, and then if you are at that intersection and you start heading southwest on 539, the first intersection you're going to get to is 4th Street. Now, at the time when that little white church was there, it faced 4th Street. In fact, its address was 216 4th Street. That was the part of the lot that it was on. There was a big empty space behind that. In a little Texas town like Sutherland Springs, that church is arguably the most important building in town. And it shows when you look between the Google Street View photos from 3 years ago versus the ones from 2008 to 2011. In 2008, all that can be seen is that small white church that is facing onto 4th Street. In 2011, a brown double-wide trailer, or what looks like one, takes up space just behind the church. Now, it's very hard to see, like, from the street if that is connected or if that is just a building that is associated with the church, if it's like a house for somebody who works there or something along those lines, or if it's just another house. But there are other buildings that are sitting nearby, like a garage and things like that. There's a couple of those. There's a little, like, community center building kind of a thing, which isn't that large. It's a little small. It's about the size of like a diner, a cramped one. So yeah, it's that sort of an area in terms of this church and what was there. If you look at it now, there is obviously a lot more because they have rebuilt and expanded and all of that. The church itself back then was small and white, fitting maybe 100 people at the best of times. Its facade faced 4th Street, which ran parallel to 87 at this part of town. Behind it sat this big empty lot. Now that is right across the street, across 87, from the SS Express gas station. Now you'll see it referred to, and you'll see signs if you look at that gas station for Valero, and that's basically what you have there. You have the Valero gas station, the gas pumps are Valero. On the outside of the building where you go in to like get snacks and sodas and cigarettes, whatever, there is an SS Express on the outside. And as I understand it, there's like a deli counter in the back that is run by a woman named Teresa, who, just like most people in small towns, a lot of people in the area. And Teresa seemed to know everybody just like everybody else did. Now, that big empty lot was something that First Baptist had been wanting to buy and build on for years. It was 3 acres. It was big, open, it was available. They could add things on there, build things on there, and have, they could have tents and have festivals, or they could have all kinds of things on this lot. But it was simply too expensive. They couldn't raise the money. They couldn't see a way to get the money. And so it was something that they wanted, but there probably wasn't going to be a likelihood that they were going to get it. There was actually a member of the congregation, Carla Holcomb, who was like a youth leader. And she would walk around the edges of this lot just praying. Just praying. And she would tell the pastors that, we're not going to have to pay for this. God is going to give it to us. I just know it. So, she had a lot of faith in that they were going to be able to get that plot of land. In 2017, that little white church was still the main building, still where everyone went for services, to listen to sermons, to pray, to sing, to talk about, their experience with joining the church and God and all of that. The church's pastor, Frank Pomeroy, led services from a podium at the front, where a raised platform served as a stage for musicians to play and sing. Now, this was nothing fancy. The interior of this church was like a drop ceiling. You have maybe like 7 or 8 rows of pews, which my dad tore down one of the many churches, or he helped tear down one of the many churches that used to be in our town before, it got to be smaller and fewer people were going to church and all of that. And we have that pew in my parents' mudroom. And the thing is, it's really heavy. It is really heavy. So they did have pews, and they had them lined up, in rows, all of that. And you can see these in video shown on Ken's 5 News from a service only days before the events of this episode. It is, it's a lot of... There's not a lot of people that you see in this video. This is from, like, the week before. And the people who are there, they're not dressed in, like, fancy clothes, Sunday best, anything like that. It's nothing like, it's not dresses and hats or anything. It is people who showed up, in, some of them are in jeans and t-shirts. You've got kids, so they're running around in, like, shorts and tank tops or whatever. But everybody is clearly, being very friendly, sharing, talking to one another, listening to music, that sort of thing. In the video, Associate Pastor Brian Holcomb, an older man with a warm demeanor and a dark blue Hawaiian shirt, smiles as he leads the congregation in prayer. After him, Air Force vet Robert Corrigan stands at the pulpit and, as part of his speech, says with a bit of a nervous laugh, quote, "And at times when you think it's hardest to praise God, that's when it's most important to praise God." Then there is another congregant who steps up to speak, Dennis Johnson. He's an older man. Both Johnson and his wife had been saved, and he spoke of how grateful he was for that and for all of the, quote, youngins and grand youngins the two had raised, which, that was adorable. The morning of November 5th, 2017 meant a busy day at First Baptist. There was lots to do to prepare for the day's events, among them making breakfast. 16-year-old Haley Kruger was dropped off bright and early at 8 a.m. by her mom. She and her mom, they had lost Haley's dad several years before this, and the church had been really helpful in supporting them. Particularly Carla Holcomb had been really great about supporting Haley and helping her, deal with her loss and her grief and all of that. Haley had shown up early to help youth leader Carla Holcomb in the kitchen whipping up food for the congregation. So they're in there, cooking, all of that. They got there bright and early. Normally, Pastor Frank Pomeroy would be present, as would his wife Sherry, but both of them were out of town that day. Pastor Pomeroy was in Oklahoma City receiving training for classes he intended to give at the church's camp on basic firearms handling. As for his wife, she was off in Florida as a FEMA contractor. The 2017 was that terribly busy Atlanta hurricane season, Harvey, Irma, Maria, and she was off assisting with the cleanup. So there was a lot going on down there that, in terms of helping people out and, getting them whatever they needed to restart or rebuild or anything like that. Now, she had waited. She was there a while. She had been there like a couple of weeks, and she had stayed so that she could attend her daughter Annabelle's 14th birthday. And then she left for Florida. Their two adopted daughters, including 14-year-old Annabelle, were staying with 71-year-old Lula White, a favorite at the church. White normally went to church with her daughter, Michelle, who'd been having some serious family problems with her son-in-law, but that day it would just be Mrs. White and Annabelle off to church. At the next weekend, Lula White, her daughter, Carla Holcomb, and Sherry Pomeroy were supposed to be going off to the Gulf Coast for a girls' trip, a vacation they often went on together. They'd go on, they'd go to the beach and they would dance and sing and just have a good time, and it was really great to have that sort of, that sort of friendship. Plenty of people were showing up that morning with their kids in tow. You have Joanne Ward, who worked with the owner of the deli counter inside the gas station, Teresa. She worked at her multiple businesses, and she would be bringing her two girls, Brooke Ward and Emily Garcia. Crystal Holcomb and her husband, John, brought her 5 kids. I believe they were from a previous marriage, as I understand their names and that sort of thing. But they were basically Holcombs at this point. And she was also pregnant as it was. She was expecting a little boy. They had already picked out a name. His name was going to be Carlin Bright. They'd been calling him Billy Bob. So they were having, they're having lots of kids and they're really enjoying it. Tara McNulty brought her 2 kids. So, everybody's bringing their kids. It is just this big room. It can fit maybe like 100 people, but with 50 people, you have, a little elbow room, all of that. It's really great. Now, at 11:12 a.m., after a stop at the gas station, a silver Ford Expedition pulled up alongside the church. Now, where it stopped, and it did stop. It was still running. The driver's side door is still wide open. When it stops, it depends on what source you're looking at. It's kind of, debatable where it stopped. But suffice it to say, it stopped outside the church. It seems to be either on 539 or on 4th Street, but, somewhere around there. Now, it says Ford Expedition. I said Ford Expedition. I should note that I believe Miracle on 4th Street says that it was an Explorer. The articles that I have seen have said, Expedition Explorer. I believe it was the police report that said Expedition, so that's what I'm going with. The man who stepped out of the vehicle would have put anyone in the vicinity on high alert as soon as they saw him. He sported black tactical gear and a vest which secured along the side of his chest with straps. He carried 2 weapons, a Glock 9mm and a Ruger semi-automatic rifle. And this rifle, by the way, is a rifle that he had been toying with for a while. Just whatever he could do to make it work better, shoot faster, shoot more, he was loading that up. And so he had been making this rifle into what he would need for what he was about to do. Identifying him just by looking at him would be difficult, considering he wore a black mask with a white skull print, pre-COVID, so not an N95, but painted with a skull similar to that of the Punisher. What's a little bit funny is that when you read articles and source materials, the police report, all of that, Secret Service report, I should say, all of that, it refers to the skull that's being talked about as the symbol of a certain comic book character. It does not say the Punisher, but that's what it is, and I think we all know that. The mask wrapped around the lower half of his face. He needed the mask. People in that church would have recognized him. At least one person definitely would have recognized him. You might expect the perpetrator to immediately enter the church and begin firing. Instead, this particular gunman decided to take a stroll. He first emptied 2 30-round clips into the front doors of First Baptist Church. You have these 2 double doors, they're closed, and he starts firing into these doors. Then he began to circle the church on the outside, counterclockwise from the front of the building, firing at First Baptist's white-walled exterior. The church wasn't built to stand up to missiles or hurricanes. Its walls were a few relatively flimsy layers of siding and plywood. It probably wouldn't even have held up to a somewhat strong tornado. This was not a fancy church. This was not a church that was meant, or at least, it was understood that if something serious happened, this thing's coming down. Like, it would take a miracle for it to stand up, given the descriptions that are given by people about this church. Now, there was a nearby witness, Kevin Jordan, who was watching all of this go on. He sees this shooter get out of the car and start walking toward the church. And at a certain point, the shooter turned to face him, saw him. He was wearing a red shirt, and so it caught his eye, and he fired on Kevin Jordan, who was able to jump back into his house and make sure that he wasn't hit, nor were any members of his family hit. But he was able to see who that was and what was going on. About this time, by the way, maybe about a couple of minutes later from when he arrived, so I want to say about 11:17 or so, you have people starting to call 911. Keep in mind, this is a very small town. Really, really tiny towns don't have police stations. In this particular instance, you're talking about Texas. Wilson County, which is where Sutherland Springs is, has a sheriff's station. It's like 12 miles away. So it's going to take officers a little bit to get there. Every minute's going to count, and yeah, they may need that good guy with a gun. So the gunfire from a Ruger semi-automatic rifle was just shredding its way through the walls of the church. Outside of the church, the gunman fired around 200 rounds at the building. He's just walking around just drilling through the church. And as he's doing that, he kills at least 2 people in the church. 2 people were dead before he even went inside. I could not find a source which could identify exactly who died first, but there were 2 people in the church who were dead before he entered, and there were 2 people outside who were found outside. And the understanding that I have from what I have read is that at some point during his scourge outside the church, he is circling around the church and he's firing on it. He encounters 64-year-old Ricardo Rodriguez and his wife Teresa. As far as I understand, that is who he saw out there. Now, I would not say for certain that's where they were. There was a lot of confusion in even articles and things written days and weeks later when there's some time for people to kind of debate what was going on there. But suffice it to say that those 2 people, these 2 married people, they had both survived cancer, and now they were no match for a determined man with a semi-automatic weapon and a decided lack of empathy. The videos I brought up at the start of the episode, the ones from an earlier service at First Baptist, were recorded from a camera setup at the rear of the room behind the pews, left of center. So when you're watching these videos, what you're seeing is, you're seeing from the back of the church. Like I said, it's a small church, so it's not like you're up high or, up by where an organ might be in a larger church. You're talking about a little bit raised and maybe close to like a second floor or like, maybe take a couple of steps up to that setup. And it is pointed forward so that it can zoom in on the stage or on whoever is speaking. And that was there so people could, they would record those so they could post them online for people who weren't able to make it. You would be able to watch the service and you could enjoy that, if you were sick, it would be something that would come in handy several years later if it weren't for whatever was going to happen this particular day. As it stands, that video setup, it's on your left as you walk in. So it's right there. Inside the church, no one would think to turn off the video camera as the gunfire began. The priority was keeping themselves and each other alive. So the video equipment would go on to record several minutes of what was about to happen. While the video has been vaguely described in several sources, it wasn't included as part of Miracle on 4th Street, whose filmmaker previously included police footage of the interior of the San Ysidro McDonald's shooting in the documentary 77 Minutes. I was, not hoping to see that footage. I certainly don't want to watch that. I don't think anybody would want to watch that. I mean, sure, there are people out there, God knows. But in terms of what happened here, I don't get the impression that this was something that you could go looking for. And I really didn't make much of an effort to find the video because not particularly something I wanted to watch. When the shooter finally burst through the front doors of First Baptist at 11:20 a.m., the congregants inside would have already been terrified. There's been bullets flying all over the place. At this point, 911 has already been called, so they've gotten in touch. The sheriff is sending people, there are officers coming, but it's gonna take them a little bit. And he walks in there and he's got his gun and he yells, he's got 2 guns. He's got his handgun and his rifle, and he yells, "Everybody is going to die, motherfuckers," or "Everybody dies, motherfuckers." Again, it depends on the source that you're looking at. He fired on the video crew. He fired on Associate Pastor Brian Holcomb, who was in the middle of walking to the pulpit to go speak. He fired on Annabelle Pomeroy, where she sat in the front row, hitting her in the chest. Joaquin Ramirez, a congregant sitting near Annabelle, urged her under the pew to prevent her from being shot again. He basically just grabbed her and, like, or just, told her, get down there. And so she got down on the floor, and I mean, she's upset, obviously, and you are talking about a church that at this point is a lot of kids. There are a lot of kids in this church, so you can imagine the sounds that must have been going on in there from all of these terrified kids. As the shooter strolled around the room from one victim to the next, he targeted the children with particular viciousness. They couldn't stop crying, and for good reason. All of them were scared, and some of them had already been shot. Some of them curled next to their injured parents. As he's firing in this building, some of those parents are passing away, and the kids are still there next to them. The shooter almost left the church. He kind of walked out at one point and reloaded, and then came back inside. Some of, but he, excuse me, got a little lost there. He went back outside, he reloads, he comes back in, and then he starts going around and, like, making sure that he's, like, putting everybody out of their misery, so to speak. Although I'm sure that's not how he was thinking about it. He's, walking to each person and just one kill shot after another. He starts targeting the kids because they're crying, they're upset, they're scared, they're crying, and he just wants to shut them up. So he's targeting them. Annabelle Pomeroy was still alive but sobbing. The gunman heard her and eliminated both the noise and her life. People did what they could to survive or to protect others. Joaquin Ramirez crawled under the shooter, behind the shooter, as he moved around the room, finishing off his victims, keeping himself out of the gunman's line of sight. The way that he tells the story is basically like wherever his back was, that's where Ramirez is going. Being very adept at avoiding him. Kyle Workman, who'd been at church with several members of his family, including his mom and his brother Chris, he bolted for the front door the first chance he got. He was out the door. He ran for the gas station across from the church with the sound of gunshots ringing in his ears. He's just, he's out the doors. He bolts over to the Valero, or the SX Express. Sutherland Springs is a small town, and the others inside knew who Kyle was. As soon as they saw him running up, they knew, oh God, it's Kyle, we have to let him in. They'd previously locked the door as soon as they realized what was going on. They start hearing shots, and they lock the door. Now, keep in mind, this is a gas station. There are these large windows at the front. If the shooter wants to get through those to shoot people, he will, but he's not going to. Kyle Workman is let inside. They unlock the doors. They let Kyle in. And Kyle says there's somebody in the church. He's firing on everybody. And then he just kind of collapsed. He's, upset, exhausted. He starts, saying, like, my family. He's just really upset. As all of this was going on, Stephen Williford was in his nearby home in his bedroom, resting. Williford was an older man with gray hair and a bit of a paunch who might be able to fill in for a mall Santa Claus in a pinch. He currently worked as an emergency plumber for a local hospital, and being on call meant catching sleep when he could. See, he lived a mere 100 feet or so away from First Baptist. He was not that far away. His daughter Stephanie, lived nearby as well, and she just burst into his house, basically, and went into his bedroom and said, Dad, doesn't that sound like gunfire to you? It took him a moment, and at first he thought, oh no, there's somebody tapping on the window, that's just what it is. But then he gets up and he walks into the kitchen and he starts listening, and he can hear it too. It's rapid, intense gunfire. If Williford had been napping before this, he was fully awake now. He could hear the repetitive pop of automatic gunfire. If anybody could recognize those sounds, it was Williford, who'd previously worked as a firearms instructor with the National Rifle Association. So he knew his way around weapons, and he knew how to handle them, and he knew how people should treat weapons and all of that. He had his rifle. He had an AR-15 in a safe in his house. And so he took that out and he starts assembling it, starts putting it together. While he is doing that, Stephanie, his daughter, she gets in her car and she drives around the block, essentially, near the church, because she's trying to find the source of these gunshots. And as she is, instead of just looking from the window or the yard, she gets in her car and starts driving around like she could have driven up on the shooter at any point. But she's driving around, and as she drives near the church, she spots the problem and rushes back to the house. She tells her father, there's a man outside the church firing at the building. He stopped outside to reload, and then he went back inside. So she kind of caught up with him at the point where he comes outside, he reloads, he goes back in. The man was wearing black tactical gear, and the gunshots weren't stopping. Williford was barefoot, but he didn't have time to put on his shoes. He didn't even think about it. He finished readying his weapon and sprinted out the front door. The entire time, he knew full well what he looked like and what that might look like to police just pulling up on the scene. Nobody knows what's going on. And so he is, he's not wearing shoes. He's carrying an AR-15. He knows if police pull up on the scene and they just know that there is an active shooter present, that he might be seen as the shooter, and he needs to be prepared for that response. There are plenty of people who do not seem to understand the very real fact that if you are in a situation where there is an active shooter and you have a weapon on you and you go to try and take them down and you take out your weapon, you have to understand that has to be part of carrying that weapon, that if the police arrive and they find both of you firing on one another, they're not going to know which one of you is the shooter. And you may be injured. You have to be prepared and understand what the result of what you're doing, charging into this situation, is going to be. And Williford, fortunately, understood that. If he saw them coming, he was thinking it out. He's just going to, weapon on the ground, arms out. I am not the threat here. I am not the one who's shooting anybody, aside from the shooter. I'm going to try and stop him, but right now, as it stands, I'm not the gunman. So that was his, in his head. As Stephen Williford was running down the street carrying his own AR-15, the shooter was still moving from one injured victim to another, firing kill shots into them if he thought they might still be alive. So he's walking through the church, going from one person to another, double checking, okay, well, this person is definitely dead, this person is not, I'll just shoot them again. Like, he's doing that. Outside, Williford heard himself shout, "Hey!" I mean, not like that. That sounds really, really happy. Just yelling, "Hey!" Like that kind of a thing. At any other time when training others with weapons, Williford would have warned them about doing something that could ruin what little element of surprise they possessed against an armed foe. Even as he's yelling it, he's thinking to himself, what am I doing? Why am I doing? What am I doing? He would later state in Miracle on 4th Street that he believed it was God calling out to the demon in the shooter, which it's not something I believe, but I can understand why he would feel that way. Because at the moment he called out, at the moment he yells, "Hey!" the shooter was standing over victim Chris Workman, who was the brother of Kyle Workman, ready to fire once again to finish him off. Chris Workman is lying there. He cannot move. He's injured. He's, trying to fake being dead so that he can, not have to do this. And the guy is standing over him and he is pointing a weapon at him. And Chris is ready. Like, he understands, like, he's about to get shot and he's about to die. And then there's that "hey." And the gunman stops. And whatever focus that he had, it just immediately is drawn to that "hey." There's like a complete change in the look on his face. And at that point, he just stalks right out the front doors of the church with his handgun. He actually drops the rifle at this point and switched to one of the handguns. At that moment, his attack on the church had been going on for about, 16 minutes or so, 7 of which were spent inside the church. The injured victims inside First Baptist remained still, hoping upon hope that whatever was going on might mean the end of all of this. But none of them risked making a run for it or trying to sneak out. Not yet. All of them that were in that church were basically at that point like, don't move, wait until this is finished, wait until we hear something that makes it clear that the shooter is not here anymore or that he's been taken down or something like that. It was very much like, the T-Rex in Jurassic Park. Sit still, don't move. The eyesight, it follows the movement, don't go anywhere. Outside, Stephen Willeford could see the perpetrator emerging from the church in his body armor and mask. Willeford was out in the open, not wearing shoes, running toward the church like a grandpa late for his own funeral. He needed cover, and he took it behind someone else's pickup truck parked at the corner across 4th Street from the church. He fired on the gunman, and the gunman responded in kind. Willeford, from the way it's described, he did not fire wildly. He kept his shots to a minimum. He and the shooter aimed at one another and fired, but Willeford wasn't hit. The shooter, however, was. Twice, at least. Willeford struck the gunman once before he got back into his Ford Expedition, and once again after the shooter rolled down the window to fire on him. Willeford fired through the rear window, hoping to get the shooter with a headshot. He only grazed him, I guess, across his forehead. It was close enough where, if there had been a millimeter to the right or a millimeter to the left or something along those lines, he would have struck him in one of his temples. It was just that, it was so close. But the shattered back window made the gunman's vehicle easily identifiable in a state where similar large trucks and SUVs are common. So the shooter gets into this truck, this Ford Expedition, and he's got a gunshot to the knee or to the leg. He's got a shot to his side because Willeford had aimed at his side where the tactical vest wasn't covering him. And so he aimed at his side and got him in the side. And he also got that graze on his head. But he didn't, the shooter wasn't dead yet. The shooter was able to get in his car and speed off on 539, headed in the direction of crossing 87 northeast. Now, parked at the intersection of 4th Street and 539, mere feet away from the front of the church, was a big old Dodge pickup driven by Johnny Langendorf. Speaking of big vehicles. Now, in later interviews, Langendorf looks like a modern-day good old boy. He's wearing a well-worn cowboy hat and sporting a large neck tattoo while responding to questions with, yes, ma'am, and no, sir. Nice little accent. He's got a little bit of facial hair. He's wearing cowboy boots and he's wearing a cowboy hat, and those are not, affectations. That's stuff that he really wears. Langendorf could see the shooter and Willeford exchange fire, and the shooter get into his Ford Expedition. He's watching this whole thing. He stopped at the stop sign, like at the other side of the intersection from these two exchanging gunfire. So he's just sitting there like, I'm not moving. I am not moving. As the expedition sped off, Stephen Willeford comes out from behind that pickup that he had been using for cover, runs over to Langendorf's pickup, yanks open the passenger side door, and he says, that guy just shot up the Baptist church. We need to stop him. Langendorf enlisted into a pursuit he didn't sign up for. Langendorf is in town because he's passing through to go see his girlfriend. And he is just sitting at this intersection, and this guy gets into his car and goes, that guy shot up the church. We need to get him. Langendorf doesn't even flinch. He waits until Willeford gets in the car, and then he slams on the gas, and he follows that expedition up 539. He rockets across the intersection between 87 and 539. He could have very well had an accident. The shooter could have very well had an accident. Either one of them could have been stopped by somebody crossing at the wrong time. Well, they were crossing at the wrong time. But anyway, Langendorf is blowing through that intersection, and he just keeps going. He is going, like, he gets up to 95. He is just speeding to try and catch up with this expedition because it is already far ahead of him. And they need to catch up with him. And like I said, 95 miles per hour, so about 152 kilometers per hour, attempting to catch up with the gunman's vehicle. He's got that back window shot out. They knew exactly which vehicle is his. Stephen Willeford and Johnny Langendorf were now participating in the sort of scenario way too many American gun owners dream they might end up in someday. Chasing down an active shooter in the absence of law enforcement. Law enforcement was coming. They got there, I would imagine, mere minutes after Langendorf and Willeford chased after the shooter. Sutherland Springs, like I said, being as small as it is, it was taken care of by the county sheriff's office, which was located in Floresville, 12 miles away from Sutherland Springs. Now, that is a short distance, but if you're talking about needing to respond to something, as soon as possible, that is forever. That is a long time. Those 7 minutes that he was in the church firing on people had to be the longest 7 minutes of those people's lives. And just waiting for police officers to show up. So 12 miles away, I mean, they have to be doing 80, 90 themselves just to make sure they get to this church and stop what's going on or help out with what's going on. One thing that Willeford was concerned about was that there was another Baptist church on 539, and they had no idea whether he meant to go there or not. They don't know what his motivations are for going into this church, and so they don't know if he's got another destination in mind or if he's just driving to get away. Langendorf got on the phone with 911. So he's driving and he's, speeding really fast and he's on the phone with 911 while Willeford keeps an eye out for the gunman's vehicle with that busted out rear window. They're catching up to him and they do. As they're doing all of this, the shooter is on the phone as well. He's in his car, and like most of us when we get in a tight spot, if we have that option, he calls his dad. But it wasn't a flat tire or a ride or some money that he needed help with. He says, "Dad, I fucked up. I just killed a bunch of people in a church. I've been shot and I'm bleeding out. I'm not ever going to get back to the house to see you again." Close quote. He then told his dad to give the phone to his wife so that he could tell her he loved her, which is a bit more complicated than it sounds. The pair finally caught up to the gunman's Ford expedition. So Langendorf and Willeford are right behind him, and Langendorf ready to do what was necessary and drive the Ford off the road if need be. He's preparing himself as they're driving down this road to ram that Dodge into that SUV and get it off the road. His car is big enough where if he does that, he should be able to get this guy off the road. At a certain point, the gunman slowed and pulled over to the side of the road near a sign. Langendorf and Willeford pulled over behind him as well. They're on the right side, they pull over. It was a trick. The second Willeford stepped out, using the passenger door as a shield, ready to use his last 2 bullets. He only had 2 bullets left. The gunman hits the gas. So now Willeford has to scramble back into the truck so Langendorf can follow him again. Just over 8 miles from Sutherland Springs, the shooter's Ford Expedition approached a curve to the right in the road. On a map, the curve isn't that severe, but in Miracle on 4th Street, the curve is clearly one of those where it wouldn't take much of a distraction for a northbound driver to end up driving off the road to the left. You're looking at your phone. It is a colder climate, and if there was a colder climate, if there was ice on the road during the winter, it might be one of those things where you skid off and end up going off the road. If there's your kids are in the back being weird, your dog is jumping around, whatever it is, it could be very easy to drive off the road here. Now, in this case, you have the driver of the expedition who's gotten done murdering all of these people. He has been shot twice. He's already clearly bleeding out and dying. And he is in pain. Whether or not he did what he did next on purpose, as easy as you please, the expedition went straight instead of following the road to the right. The entrance to a dirt driveway with fencing on either side sat there, with empty fields on either side. The expedition swerved into the field and then stopped there, like the field to the right of this dirt driveway. Different accounts say it flipped, that he drove through on purpose, that Williford held his weapon on the SUV and ordered the shooter to come out. Williford actually says, we saw the truck, the SUV go off the road, we pull over, I get out, I lean across the hood of the truck with my weapon, and I order him to get out of the car. And I guess he was telling him to get out of the car for a little bit, and he wasn't getting out. And then the police arrive on the scene. However, those last seconds of the chase occurred. It ended with the gunman using his gun on one more victim, himself. When law enforcement finally arrived at the site where the expedition swerved off the road, they decided to approach the vehicle with a drone for the safety of their officers. When the drone flew closer, it showed the driver's side door wide open. The shooter, dead of a bullet wound to the head, had fallen most of the way out of the car, only his legs still inside the driver's side on the floorboard, while his head rested on the ground. So, the description that Stephen Williford gives doesn't say that the body fell out or anything like that, but clearly either the driver shot himself and he fell out, or Williford went to check on him, or Langendorf, or one of them, and opened the door, and he just fell out. So, 27 people would die when a gunman burst into the First Baptist Church in Sutherland Springs, Texas, on November 5th, 2017. 49 people were in the church when he entered, and when he left, every single person inside was either dead or injured. I'm going to get more into this in the next episode, but there's a lot to this story, and I want to get through all of it. I am definitely going to be working on the second part of this episode. There may be a third part, because like I said, there is a lot to this story. A lot. And given everything that's been going on lately, I feel like this is a story that we need to look at. So, in terms of what is going to happen with this particular episode, I'm going to finish right now, and then I am going to switch over to recording part 2. And if you are listening to this on the main feed and you want to listen to part 2, then all you have to do is sign up for the Patreon, and you can access part 2 and perhaps part 3 if I need to resort to that. So, thank you so much for listening to this particular episode. I will save any comments or anything I have to say for the last video, and until next time, stay safe.